Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to all things nuclear.
I'm joined now by Tom Killough, Director of Policy.
Joe Cirincione, President of the Ploughshares Fund.
Philip Yoon, the Executive Director of the Ploughshares Fund.
Development Director from Ploughshares Fund, Elizabeth Warner.
And here's today's guest host, Michelle Dover.
Thank you, Dal, and welcome to Press the Button. My name is Michelle. I am the Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund, filling in for Joe this week. We have a very special episode. We start off with Early Warning, a 7-minute analysis of the nuclear news you need. And joining me for that segment will be John Carlbaker, Senior Program Officer, and Catherine Killough, Hale Fellow here at Ploughshares Fund. Later on, Joe sits down for an in-depth interview with Beatrice Fihn, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also known as ICAN. ICAN was the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Beatrice will also be our keynote speaker at Chain Reaction, an event held in San Francisco on Monday, June 10th. If you want to know more about tickets, go to ploughshares.org. But first, the news.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
We have a lot of news to get through in these 7 minutes. The clock is ticking. Catherine, what are you watching this week?
Well, on North Korea, I want to bring our attention to something we don't usually talk about, which is their food insecurity crisis, which the World Food Program has reported as being a critical situation, and they are facing a food production shortfall for their upcoming harvest. And so the international community has been sort of rallying to get humanitarian aid in, medical, nutritional, food, including South Korea. What I find interesting is the way that this issue is being taken up with the stalled nuclear talks. And it's a bit disturbing to me the way it's become politicized. And there's this question of how to condition the provision of aid to some sort of political leverage for reviving the talks.
Yeah, just recently, I think it was last week, I heard the Japanese foreign minister say the common line we often hear, which is that, well, North Korea isn't providing for its own citizens, it's directing resources into bad things like the nuclear weapons program. Why should we fill the gap? And that's a disturbing line, right? Because it implies that simply because they're engaged in bad behavior, that their populace has to suffer, or that the only reason to give them aid is so we can use it as leverage to do something else.
No, and I think, your point too of like the reasons that we do it, I think it's something that we can absolutely be cognizant of the impact it will have on ongoing negotiations, but we should just be careful in looking at the reasons we do it and how.
Right. And I have another North Korea story that I wanted to talk about. Just recently, I think yesterday, Army General Robert Abrams, who's the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, was quoted saying some interesting things about the suspension of military exercises. And as you recall, this suspension is a little controversial here in the United States. But Abrams chimed in, and what he said about it was he called it a prudent action in support of diplomacy. And he continued and was quite critical of people who were saying that the suspension of exercises are adversely impacting readiness, that no training is happening between U.S. forces and South Korean forces. And what he said was, any suggestions to the contrary, and I've heard them all, are simply not true. This is a meme most often repeated by theorists and pundits who simply do not know the ground truth. So some pretty harsh words there. And we do hear that line a lot. So I think it's important to remember that Abrams, who's there on the ground commanding the forces, thinks that the suspension of large-scale exercises is a good thing. And he's making the point that it doesn't mean there's no training going on, that the sides aren't engaging with one another. They still are. We just have suspended the large-scale exercises to try to push diplomacy forward.
Honestly, I am most surprised that General Abrams knows what a meme is, but I find this very reassuring.
Well, I also think it's like quite an interesting shot at the rest of, the Washington commentariat, but not just the commentariat, right? Like also, I don't know about you, but like looking at that, it seems to be a shot at those even within the administration with whom he has differences. Are you seeing anything else that highlights the tensions between various members of the administration?
Yes, it's well known that the internal workings of the Trump administration are pretty chaotic, shall we say. But there's a huge CNN report that just came out about tensions between Mike Pompeo and John Bolton that's worth a read because it relates to some of the major instances of crisis that are happening right now in North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and elsewhere, and some ways in which Bolton is trying to muscle in apparently on Pompeo's turf. And that's just driving a wedge between them. The story is worth reading for a lot of reasons, but it's interesting that it includes a fact that's being reported that apparently Trump is blaming Bolton for pushing his diplomatic efforts with North Korea to the side and making the whole thing go awry. And if that's the case, and people on the outside keep hammering this point home, it's possible that Bolton's days could be numbered. Trump does not like when his plans get thwarted.
No, we're also seeing these divisions play out on Iran. There was a series of closed-door briefings up on the Hill this week as, representatives from State Department, defense, intelligence agencies were trying to give an analysis of what the actual threat is from Iran and why the administration is escalating the rhetoric and in some cases the actions. And, I think as long as these divisions are so very public, where you have a president who says he doesn't want to go to war, but you have, other members of the administration saying, but actually it's something we should seriously consider, I think the risk for conflict as a result of miscalculation is really high. So we only have about a minute left. Catherine, was there anything else on your radar this week?
Yes, I think it'd be appropriate to round out this segment with a little reminder that our nuclear past continues to haunt us. The Washington Post recently reported that there is a site in the Marshall Islands that holds nuclear waste, which is cracking open. And to give a little bit of context, in the 1950s, the U.S. military conducted over 60 nuclear tests in the Pacific, and it was only in the 1970s that we began cleanup efforts. And by cleanup, I mean that we collected about 2.5 million cubic feet of radioactive surface soil across the islands, dumped it into a crater that was left behind from a former nuclear test, and sealed that crater off with concrete. And that was meant to be a temporary solution, but clearly we have not rectified that. I think, this is a sort of perfect representation of the very real consequences of our nuclear negligence. And, even as our government looks to the future to modernize its weaponry, it's clear that we have not fully reckoned with the actions of our past.
And with that, the 7 minutes are up. Thank you, Catherine and John Carl, and everyone tune in next week for your nuclear news.
And now, Joe Cirincione sits down with Beatrice Fihn of ICAN.
We're here with Beatrice Fihn, who's the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, great acronym, a campaign coalition aimed at prohibiting and eliminating nuclear weapons. Beatrice and the campaign won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, and I was honored to be at the ceremony in Oslo, Norway, where you, Beatrice, gave a fabulous speech. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's really a real pleasure to be here.
Could you just tell us a little bit about what ICAN is and what you're doing right now, and how did it affect you to win the Nobel Peace Prize? How has it changed the organization?
Well, it's a campaign coalition, so it's not an organization. We have NGOs that are members of ICAN, so it's like we're coordinating a big sort of group of partner organizations around the world. And yeah, we're working to sort of unify the movement in one big push to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons, and mainly through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. ICAN was instrumental in pushing governments to negotiate and conclude that treaty. And now we're working on getting it to enter into force, and then we will implement it and use it as a tool to stigmatize nuclear weapons.
I think many people in the United States don't know this treaty even exists. I wasn't even aware of the push for it until I went to one of the conferences you helped organize in December 2014 in Vienna on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And that is actually the first I heard of this push. And it's remarkable how quickly this treaty idea took hold and then passed the United Nations. Can you just tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, ICAN was founded in 2007, but it took a couple of years for ICAN to sort of find its role and strategy on what we're going to do. It was very much inspired by the campaign to ban landmines, which also won the Nobel Prize in 1997, that they had this kind of humanitarian disarmament framing, that it's not just a strategic security issue or national security, it's about human security. It's a humanitarian issue, and what happens when these weapons are used, that's how we should judge them. So we learned from them, really, looking at the humanitarian impact. And we worked very closely with the Norwegian government on a first conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which just started a different kind of conversation around these weapons, reframing the discussion. And then in Vienna, at that third conference, it was sort of... if you look at nuclear weapons, what they do to people, the health impact, the long-term impact, what the radiation do over generations, you kind of, it's difficult not to draw the conclusion that this should be illegal.
Right.
It shouldn't be legal to wipe out whole cities. So there was sort of like, a slippery slope for governments. Once you start engaging in the humanitarian narrative around nuclear weapons, you kind of come to the unacceptability of them.
Which is why we never talk about it here in Washington.
Absolutely. I mean, this is intentional to remove all human beings from the conversation, remove the kind of humanity on this issue.
That's exactly right. Here it's about strategy and doctrine and their role in keeping us safe and the role that nuclear weapons have in preventing wars. We never talk about what actually happens when you use these weapons.
And it's not just in the United States. It's all over the world. I still go to countries that are part of nuclear weapons alliances, for example, and that thinking is very ingrained, and it's quite hard to change it around once you started on with that starting point. I've actually started just as a personal thing, like when I go into meetings, you start by acknowledging the risk and that the risk is increasing for nuclear weapons use. And just take a couple of seconds to talk about the humanitarian consequences. It changes the whole conversation. If you talk about the blast, the radiation, the sort of impact, the firestorms, just to put that out there in the beginning puts people in a different kind of mood when you talk about it. And it's quite impressive to see just what it did to the international conversation and what it can do to a one-to-one person conversation.
One of your biggest allies in this is the Catholic Church. And I was struck in Vienna in 2014 when I heard the papal envoy give his speech and his greetings. And then several years later in a special Vatican conference in November 2017, you were there. Right? Yeah. I think I saw the picture of you sitting next to the Pope.
I know. So cool.
So cool. Well, Pope Francis gives a speech, and in it he says that if we also take into account the risk of an accidental detonation as a result of error of any kind, the threat of their use as well as their very possession is to be firmly condemned. He calls these weapons immoral, he says, and this is the quote that stuck with me, for they exist in the service of a mentality of fear that affects not only the parties in conflict, but the entire human race. And I've been thinking about that, ever since. It isn't that people haven't said this before. It's just how much it strikes me here in America now, in our current situation, our current circumstances, how much we live in a climate of fear. And when you come to international relations, the United States thinks nothing of threatening other countries with nuclear use in a way we would never think of with other weapons.
And I think that it's important to remember this is not the only issue that we've done that. We've done that on women's rights. We've done that on racism, for example. We have dehumanized or not thought about the impact and just taken the current status quo for granted. And I think for me, it's a position of privilege and power The people that are privileged and are in power, they don't have to think about the consequences. They don't have to think about that other side. So I think that, starting to have these kind of conversation about what happens when these weapons are used, how it's so bizarre that we think that that's acceptable to wipe out a whole city of schools, hospitals, how is that possible?
You said in your speech accepting the Nobel Prize that countries no longer threaten to use sarin gas in an emergency situation, or countries don't threaten others with the release of the plague or botulism should they fail to accede to their demands or threaten them. So these chemical and biological weapons, which have been ruled illegal by international treaty, are now off the table. They're taboo. And you're trying to do the same with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated with some countries that have prohibited landmines because
Yes.
they indiscriminately target or impact civilians. Yet they are fine with threatening to mass murder civilians with nuclear weapons. I mean, those two things don't, how can you do one thing and not the other thing? How can you think it's legitimate to threaten to use these weapons? And a lot of people do it because, well, we're not actually going to use them. We're just threatening to use them.
Yes.
But you can't credibly threaten to use these weapons without actually being prepared to use them. And I think that's really what we need to challenge decision making. It's like, you are actually prepared to use them. And with this president here in the United States, I have no doubt that he would be prepared to use them if he felt like it.
He's threatened it on numerous occasions.
Exactly. So I think we really have to, if you are part of deterrence, if you believe in deterrence, you also have to accept the responsibility of the eventual use of nuclear weapons. And we have to talk about that. What does that mean? Is that ever in the military interest of a country to wipe out civilian populations?
Well, let me ask you this. There's some people who use the formulation, we want to prevent a nuclear weapon from ever being used again. But that kind of skirts the issue, doesn't it? I mean, the idea is that we keep them in their silos, we keep them in the subs, and we will never use them, but they're there in an emergency. But that's different from what the Pope is saying, that their very possession is immoral, because we practice, we have to be prepared to use them. We have to convince the enemy that we would unleash thousands of nuclear weapons within, well, as we now know, within 5 minutes of a decision to launch.
Yeah, I mean, it's become really bizarre. And I think that's why it's so powerful to talk about what happens then. Because you can only have these conversations and make it sound rational and sane if you never go into the consequences, if you never actually admit that they will be used one day. I think that's really, a lot of times people talk about disarmament as nuclear disarmament would be naive, unrealistic. I think it's naive and unrealistic to think that you can threaten with them forever and be prepared and exercise and say we're going to do this one day and then never happen. I mean, it's going to happen. If we don't get rid of nuclear weapons, it's going to happen one day. And then what? So I think we have to have the starting point that nuclear weapons will be used one day if we don't do anything about it.
And so what are you doing about it? What is your day, your week, your months like now?
Oh, well, still a lot of emailing, tweeting. No. I think we're working with the treaty, of course, seeing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons as a way to delegitimize nuclear weapons. I don't think that you can ever get rid of nuclear weapons unless you think that they are bad weapons. Unless there's a sort of a consciousness that these weapons aren't protecting us, they are threatening us. So we know that the way for nuclear armed states to get rid of them is going to go through steps. But I think there has to be a fundamental drive from the public that we don't want these weapons. If you think about other causes, you're not going to get rid of racism by saying, we can be a little bit racist on Mondays and Tuesdays, but not Wednesdays and Thursdays. I mean, you have to have a strong, that's unacceptable, and then drag all the sort of half-racist people with you and then approach the next level of people. And I think it's the same thing with nuclear weapons. We have to have a very strong kind of moral position. These weapons are unacceptable, immoral, inhumane. They would poison, wipe out big parts of the population, and then sort of push governments into taking steps towards that. So through signing and ratification of the treaty, we're trying to chip away at the legitimacy of nuclear weapons.
So the treaty was voted on at the United Nations how long ago?
a year and a half ago.
120 nations voted in favor of the treaty. So now it has to enter into force, meaning that some of those 120 voting nations have to ratify it. Where are we on that?
So right now, 70 countries have ratified and 70 countries have signed. And 23 have ratified. So when we hit 50 ratifications, the treaty will enter into force.
And what do you think? What's the prognosis?
Well, we were hoping for the end of this year, but government's a bit slower than expected.
Yes.
I mean, it's what we're finding, of course, going from a very international focus where we worked in the UN in the same room and we were in touch with diplomats to kind of try to untangle 70 countries' ratification processes on a domestic level. It's quite complicated. So it's really, I mean, it's a little bit slower than we wanted. It's getting there. I mean, I think we're going to, hopefully within a year, I think. There's a lot of countries that are
So perhaps in 2020?
Yeah, I think in 2020.
And what happens then? Then the treaty is international law. The international law says nuclear weapons are illegal. But none of the countries that have nuclear weapons have signed this treaty or support this treaty. They actively oppose it. So what happens then?
Well, it's not going to be a magic moment where, everything will change. International law is a tool, and it is what we make of it. So we have to now use this law to create a norm and create expectations on countries. And that has already started. We're working in a country like the United States on local level, both with local politicians on a sort of city and state level, but also cultural. People need to refer to this treaty. If people think that nuclear weapons are illegal and unacceptable, that's how the norms is going to change. So I think there's a lot of public awareness raising, campaigning, getting people to protest these weapons. And I think the two of them feeds each other. The fact that there is a law makes it a lot easier for activists here in the United States to protest the modernization program. You can point that the rest of the world has banned this. This is illegal behavior according to international law. But it also kind of feeds, like, when governments in the rest of the part of the world sees that activities are happening in the United States, for example, that decision makers here are starting to support this idea, it's going to feed their interest to sign and ratify the treaty as well.
So when you're working internationally on this, do you see the arms control groups, the arms control movement as a help in your abolition efforts, or are they an obstacle? Is there a contradiction between moving for complete nuclear disarmament and moving to just control the weapons?
No, I think they can benefit each other. And I think that we see that on many political issues right now. I think you need a radical vision. You need a strong, progressive vision. I think we see that with the Democrats here in this country right now, that you need to mobilize people, inspire people, make people believe that change is possible. We do know that it has to happen through progressive steps. But I think civil society's role is really to articulate a vision and inspire people to get active. It's very hard to inspire people with a fissile material cutoff treaty, for example. People are like, what? You have to get people to buy it. Like, why should they get engaged? What's the goal here? If the goal is just to maintain status quo, that's not inspirational for people.
Or to modestly reduce the nuclear forces.
Absolutely. And I think also, is that the best strategy to get politicians to do those steps? I think we have to drive harder as society and raise expectations to get them to take these steps. If we put the bar for progress so low that they barely have to do anything to fulfill it, then that's going to be seeming difficult to politicians. But I do think that these different roles can complement each other. I'm very aware that the United States is not going to change overnight and just suddenly decide to get rid of all nuclear weapons. It's going to have to go in steps. So I think that there's a benefit in having different types of organizations working on these issues.
Yes, in the very first podcast, we interviewed Dr. Carol Cohn, who talked about the insidious use of the word realistic, how realistic is used to dismiss those who are threatening the status quo, who are advocating something other than the established doctrine. Does this come up with you? Are you accused of being unrealistic?
Absolutely, all the time. I mean, it's really frustrating, right? And I feel like, you know, the work that Carol has done on sort of the gendered language around this is really remarkable, because, and I think it really harms all the efforts, because by talking about weapons as normal and rational and strength, the more weapons we have, the stronger we are. We know that societies that invest in healthcare, education, is safer for people.
Yes.
Yet somehow we see weapons and use of force as strength and rational. And we see things like diplomacy and compromise and agreements like that as weakness. It's somehow stronger to go to war than come up with a peaceful solution that benefits both. And I can see the Iran deal is such a clear example of that somehow Iran got advantages from a negotiation. So it's bad. Like it's a zero-sum game. Like, of course, it's a negotiations. How can a peaceful solution where both parties win be seen as weakness, as something bad? So I think that we really have to challenge what's considered strength, what security is. I don't get the feeling that Americans feel very safe, despite the fact that you have so many nuclear weapons.
Right.
I mean, you have the biggest military power in the world. Why would you need nuclear weapons if other countries don't feel like you need them?
Yes. You know, in some ways, we're cursed by our success in World War II. We expect that all wars are going to end that way. All conflicts, all disagreements are going to end with Japanese generals showing up on the deck of the USS Missouri and signing an unconditional surrender. Well, guess what? That doesn't happen very often. And so compromise is seen as failure.
And I think we have to admit also, and this is my frustration with the realists. I mean, if you're being a realist, you see that warfare is changing. Conflict is changing.
Yes.
It is no longer black and white. It's no longer an invasion of other countries. It is messy. It's gray areas. It is information warfare. It is insurgent strikes. It is not clear who's fighting who even. So nuclear weapons are pretty useless in a new modern sort of context. Right. And the military isn't actually thinking about using nuclear weapons. They want to have high-tech weapons. They're looking into cyber warfare. They're looking into artificial intelligence. All these things are going to not only be the way that they fight war, but it's also going to make the existing nuclear weapons more dangerous and risky. So I think it's really, even for the people who consider themselves realists, which I challenge, I think that they have to wake up and look at actually the changing international security environment. You can't just drop a nuclear bomb on a city in this context. Yeah. That's not how we do warfare anymore.
Right.
It's completely useless.
Who actually has the more realistic view of our security needs?
Exactly. Right? But I think there's a certain group of people who have claimed that they are the authority. They are the ones that know best on this issue. And I think that has also shaped how the public engage with this issue, that the public don't feel like they have a voice. Like, don't bother your little, pretty head with these things. It's for the security crowd. It's for the defense expert community. It's too complicated for you. You don't understand. It's not so simple as just banning the bomb. Well, maybe it is.
Maybe it is. Well, thank you very much, Beatrice, for
thank you.
Not just taking the time here, but for everything you do, and for teaching us that maybe it is as simple as just banning the bomb. If people want to know more about ICAN, where should they go?
They should go to icanw.org and find out what we're up to and sign up and get more information on how to get involved.
And if they do want to get involved, what are the kinds of things people can do about this issue?
Lots of things. I mean, you have all the traditional stuff, of course, contacting your politicians, which I feel like people need to do. We need to be very vocal, but I think we also have to find new ways of engaging people and new ways for people to change. I think we have to stop thinking that politicians are going to solve this for us.
Yes.
There needs to be a cultural shift on nuclear weapons as well. We have accepted as a community that these weapons are just okay to have. And I think that artists can contribute, tech companies can contribute, scientists can contribute. I was talking about this earlier today. Like, I have this amazing sort of example from Sweden in the 80s. There was this group called Hairdressers Against Nuclear Weapons. And I just like the idea that people, like any group of people or any kind of person who does something, could find a way to get engaged and do something. And we don't have to leave it to politicians to do it. Like, we can also just shift perceptions in a society, and that will influence the next generation of politicians.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
And now, a special announcement about an upcoming Ploughshares Fund event.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Senior Development Officer at Ploughshares Fund, and I'm here to tell you about an exciting event we have coming up on Monday, June 10th in San Francisco. The event, Chain Reaction 2019, will highlight a new moment we see now to reshape the national debate on nuclear strategy. We are thrilled to have Beatrice Fihn as our keynote speaker. She's the executive director of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Other speakers include former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, author Eric Schlosser, and nuclear historian Alex Wellerstein. Tickets are on sale now at ploughshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Megan McCall. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Theme music is by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.